This is a short video about the Federal Aviation Administration's Noise Policy Review. It provides an update on the status of the FAA's review of comments submitted to the Noise Policy Review Federal Register Notice and discusses next steps in the review process. The Noise Policy Review Federal Register Notice was published on May 1, 2023, with an initial 90-day comment period that was planned to end on July 31, 2023. The notice included a background on the FAA's civil aircraft noise policy, outlined the policy review process, and requested input on 11 questions focused on noise metrics and thresholds and how or if they should be modified as part of this policy review, as they represent the foundational elements of the FAA's civil aircraft noise policy to which other FAA orders and regulations that implement the policy refer. In conjunction with the notice, the FAA also published a companion framing paper titled The Foundational Elements of the Federal Aviation Civil Aviation Noise Policy, the Noise Measurement System, its component noise metrics, and noise thresholds. This paper was intended to be read in conjunction with the Federal Register Notice and provided additional context on the questions posed in the notice, as well as provided additional context on the FAA's current civil aviation noise policy. In response to comments from the public, elected officials, as well as industry and trade groups, the FAA extended the comment period for the Noise Policy Review Federal Register Notice by an additional 60 days, and the comment period closed on September 29, 2023. In conjunction with the publication of the Noise Policy Review Federal Register Notice in May 2023, the FAA conducted a variety of outreach activities to educate stakeholders on our aviation noise policy, as well as provide clarity and answer questions on how stakeholders can provide meaningful feedback to the FAA. This included 4 national webinars, which were held in May 2023, and multiple briefings throughout the summer and fall of 2023 to community organizations, trade groups, and airport operators as requested. In addition to the webinars and briefings, the FAA created educational videos which provided a background on aviation noise, the FAA's noise policy, the Federal Register Notice, and providing meaningful feedback to the FAA. The FAA also translated various noise policy review materials into Spanish and Chinese. Lastly, the FAA created and has periodically updated a noise policy review landing page that contains educational materials, videos, recordings of the webinars, and updates on the status of the policy review and next steps. As noted previously, the Noise Policy Review Federal Register Notice comment period closed on September 29, 2023. During the comment period, we received 4,857 comments that were submitted to the docket. The FAA is in the process of reviewing all of these comments through a multi-step process. Steps in the process include developing a database of comments, categorizing the comments, and generating statistical summaries of who submitted comments, where comments were submitted, and what topics were identified with regards to noise impacts and policy recommendations, and identifying common themes from the comments and synthesizing relevant excerpts to aid in policy deliberations. The FAA is currently engaged in the second step of this process. Once the comment review is complete, the FAA will utilize the themes identified from stakeholders in the comment review to identify a range of inputs on noise metrics, noise thresholds, and other noise policy issues. These inputs will inform further policy deliberations and the development of recommendations on potential changes to our noise policy. As noted on the previous slide, FAA received 4,857 comments on the Noise Policy Review Federal Register Notice. Examining the breakdown of the comments further, 4,608 comments were submitted from individuals, where 249 comments were submitted by organizations which represent community groups, industry and trade groups, local and state governments, as well as elected officials. Roughly 75% of the comments provided a location associated with them. The remaining 25% did not specify a location. We received many comments that endorsed a comment submitted by another, whether that be an organization or an individual. The comment endorsed the most was that submitted by the Aviation Impacted Communities Alliance, or AICA, which received 643 endorsements from other commenters. As noted previously, the Federal Register notice posed 11 questions regarding the FAA's current noise policy and use of metrics and thresholds. Only 4% of commenters responded directly to those 11 questions. This was not unexpected, as we expected commenters to speak to lived experiences regarding aviation noise if they were uncomfortable or unable to answer the 11 questions posed in the notice directly. Many chose to comment on the notice in this way and express what concerns they have about aviation noise and how it impacts their lives. The following slides provide some high-level statistics on the comments, including summaries based on commenter, location, issues identified, and noise metrics. It is important to note that the FAA is considering comments submitted on the Federal Register notice equally and is reviewing all the comments received. The statistical summaries that follow are preliminary and represent how many times specific locations, categories of commenters, issues, and noise metrics identified appeared in the comments. The FAA is continuing to review comments and may refine these summaries as the review continues. Likewise, many comments from a particular area or identifying a particular issue does not mean the FAA is weighing comments from that area or location more than those from other locations or highlighting other issues. The comment review for the notice is not a popularity contest, and the FAA is reviewing and treating all comments equally. Considering who submitted comments to the notice, 81% of commenters were named individuals. This was followed by 13% of commenters choosing to remain anonymous. The remaining 6% of commenters consisted of organizations such as community groups, aviation industry groups, local governments, and other groups, which included entities such as private businesses not associated with the aviation industry. Further examining the organizations and government agencies that submitted comments, which represented 5% of the comments, 64% of the comments were from community groups such as advisory groups, airport advisory boards, airport noise forum or roundtables, or other non-government organizations. This was followed by those from government entities at 20%, including state and local governments, as well as state, local, and federal elected officials. The remaining 15% of comments were submitted by a combination of airport operators or sponsors, aviation industry trade groups or manufacturers, and other groups such as private business entities not associated with aviation. In analyzing how comments were distributed geographically across the country for those comments for which a location was included, which was roughly 75% of the comments, 51% of the comments came from the states of California, Colorado, and New York, with California having the most at 30%. Thinking about groups of states, New England constituted 5%. New York and New Jersey constituted 11%. Maryland, Washington, D.C., and Virginia constituted 9%. States in the Mid-Atlantic region constituted 21%. In some cases, commenters mentioned a specific airport in their comment. This slide presents the top 10 airports mentioned in the comments, which occurred in 48% of the comments received. Considering these airports, Sacramento International Airport had the most comments mentioned at 725. Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport had the second most at 296, and Ronald Reagan National Airport had the third most at 174. Preliminary review of the comments indicates the large number of comments received mentioning the Sacramento International Airport were associated with a focused effort by local communities to express concerns about noise generated from the airport due to commercial aircraft operations, whereas those received mentioning the Rocky Mountain Metropolitan Airport were associated with recent increases in the volume of flight training activity at that airport. Considering what types of aircraft were most commented on and the types of operations, the type of aircraft was mentioned in 61% of the comments, with jet aircraft being mentioned the most at 1,566 comments. New entrants, such as unmanned aircraft systems or drones, and urban air mobility or electric air taxis were the second most mentioned at 992 comments. Helicopters were the third most mentioned aircraft type at 867 comments, followed closely by supersonic aircraft at 766 comments. The type of operation was mentioned in 26% of the comments, with flight training, aerobatics, and skydiving being mentioned the most at 509 comments. Tourism, such as sightseeing tours, was the second most mentioned at 318 comments, and air carrier operations, such as those by the airlines, was the third most mentioned at 296 comments. Considering what aspects of aviation noise were most concerning and how aviation noise affected the commenters' lived experience, the aspect of noise that was of concern was mentioned in 72% of the comments, with nighttime noise being mentioned the most at 2,139 comments. The number or frequency of noise events was the second most mentioned, closely behind nighttime noise at 2,057 comments. The intensity or loudness of the noise was the third most mentioned at 1,221 comments. How aviation noise affected the commenters was mentioned in 65% of the comments. Most commenters indicated general quality of life was negatively impacted without specifying a specific negative effect such as to health, sleep, speech, economics, or learning, and general quality of life was mentioned in 2,003 comments. Health impacts were mentioned the second most at 1,404 comments, and sleep impacts were mentioned the third most at 1,344 comments. Considering other factors identified by the commenters related to aviation noise, which were mentioned in 73% of the comments, NextGen was mentioned the most, with 1,965 comments. General references to flight paths and flight path concentrations were mentioned the second most, with 1,701 comments, and general references to the altitude of aircraft were mentioned the third most, with 1,380 comments. Considering whether or not the comments submitted contained a recommendation for changes to the FAA's noise policy or reflected a comment or concern about aviation noise, a majority of the comments, at 55%, contained a comment or concern regarding aviation noise, but did not specify any suggested revisions or recommendations to the FAA's noise policy. 24% of the comments contained recommendations for changes to the FAA's noise policy, and 19% provided an endorsement of comments submitted by others that contained recommendations for changes to our noise policy. This means roughly 43% of the comments received contained recommendations. 2% of the comments did not identify an issue related to a comment or concern about aviation noise, nor a recommendation for policy changes. Considering noise metrics and which noise metrics commenters recommended for use in the FAA's noise policy or did not recommend, which were mentioned in 27% of the comments, the cumulative day-night average sound level, or DNL metric, was mentioned the most in 959 comments, without specifying context of whether it should be used relative to a location close or far away from an airport. In this context, most commenters did not recommend continuing to use DNL in the FAA's noise policy. However, if the DNL or the Community Noise Equivalent Level, or CNEL, cumulative metrics were mentioned with regards to communities that were located close to an airport. Both these metrics were mentioned in 1,325 comments. And most commenters in this context recommended continuing to use these metrics for these communities. In the context of communities further from the airport or overflight communities, DNL was mentioned in 247 comments, and most commenters did not recommend the use of DNL for these communities. Second to the DNL metric, without mention of a location, the number above a maximum sound level, or NA metric, was the second most mentioned, which was mentioned in 916 comments, with nearly all commenters recommending its use. It should be noted for all the metrics presented in this sentiment analysis that not all metrics are shown, and some of these metrics include comments that also reference the inclusion of ambient noise. A metric not being included in this summary or lack of discussion of ambient noise does not mean the FAA is not considering comments that contain references to those elements. Considering the averaging of noise metrics, whether with use with the current DNL metric or other metrics, when the average annual day averaging mechanism was specified in a comment, a majority of the comments did not recommend it being used. However, when an averaging mechanism using a peak level of operations was used, a majority of the comments did recommend that averaging mechanism be considered. It is interesting to note that the general concept of averaging was overall not recommended in the comments, where a general discussion of averaging was mentioned. This indicates many commenters do not support the concept of averaging a metric regardless of the mechanism used. Lastly, some commenters express support for the concept of averaging noise metrics based on seasonal periods. Next steps. Once the comment review is complete, the FAA will utilize the themes identified from stakeholders in the comment review to identify a range of inputs on noise metrics, noise thresholds, and other noise policy issues. These inputs will inform further policy deliberations and the development of recommendations on potential changes to our noise policy. When these deliberations on recommendations are complete, the FAA expects to publish a second Federal Register notice announcing our policy recommendations. This second Federal Register notice will provide an opportunity for feedback from stakeholders via the associated public comment period. Due to the large number of comments received, timelines for completion of the comment review for the Noise Policy Review Federal Register notice, development of policy recommendations, and publications of a second Federal Register notice announcing potential changes to our noise policy are unclear. However, as the FAA completes review of received comments, periodic updates on timelines and next steps for the noise policy review will be provided to stakeholders and posted to the FAA's Noise Policy Review webpage at the link above.